Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marfine Chan. I am Executive Director of Maine, and we are a tenant of the Equality Community Center. No, this is not the Maine Asian American Community Center. We're not taking over, but we've been a tenant of the ECC since 2023, when we started to grow as an organization. And obviously with that growth, we also wanted to reach out to other Asian American organizations, especially after 2021, after the Atlanta shootings that killed 6 or 7 Asian American women. It set off quite a movement across the country, the Stop Asian Hate movement. And through that, through the rallies, through the protests, through the convenings that have come about after the Atlanta shootings, the Asian American community in Maine is a lot stronger than it was before 2020 COVID and the Atlanta shootings, to the point where we're actually envisioning a center of our own in Westbrook, Maine, which we're currently in the feasibility study stage, and we're looking into sort of what is our goal, and what is a fundraising goal, and what are some of the other things like programming that we want to include with that. And a large part of the inspiration is actually from the Equality Community Center. So I myself am a queer Asian man, and I first met Chris back in college when he was a student life director. And lo and behold, 10 years later, the Equality Community Center itself was starting to get off the ground. It was starting to do fundraising, and they had asked me to be on the board. And I served on the board for about 2 years during the early stages of the Capitol campaign. And of course, I gleaned as much as I could and learned about as much as I could about the early processes. And so it's really symbolic that this event is happening here, and that we are collaborating, partnering. So I do want to give a hand of applause to Chris for hosting us. And if you want to learn more about the Maine Asian American Community Center, we're still working on a good acronym. I guess that's what the MAACC.
The MAACC.
But our website is meaacc.org. And so you can check out that website a little bit later and sign up for newsletters and updates. We're just getting rolling on more consistent updates around events and programming. But I do want to introduce Josh Su, who has been one of the biggest steering committee members to step up to not only just sit on a committee and hear me talk, but also get involved, get his hands dirty, and help organize events like this one. So when Curtis Chin and his agent reached out to us, was it in the fall?
My agent, it was just me.
Oh, it was just you. Sorry.
That's what we do, is it right? Yeah.
I was hoping to make you sound bigger than your operation. But Josh Su took it and ran with it, did the interviews, did the organizing. So Josh Su, I don't know what your official title at Forge Theater Labs is.
Just founder, executive producer.
Founder, head creator,
yes.
Wizard behind the curtain. I want to introduce Josh, who's going to introduce our author and take us into the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Marfine. You can take that off. Yeah, great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the founder of Forge Theater Labs, and today we're here to celebrate a story that reflects both Detroit's spirit and one family's journey. We're joined by Curtis Chin, author, filmmaker, and activist whose work spans media, academia, and social justice. Curtis also co-founded the Asian American Writers Workshop and has also worked in politics. This afternoon, we're going to discuss his memoir, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant, which tracks his journey from boyhood to adulthood, and it explores belonging, family resilience, and food. And I just want to let's give a warm round of applause to Curtis.
Hi. It's on? It's good?
It's good. It's good.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thank you to Josh. Thank you to Marfine and Mac, I believe, for inviting me. Should I just start and talk a little bit? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love for you to set the table for the conversation. And if you could read some of that beginning sort of chapter of the tea, I would love that.
Sure. Okay. So hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I also have to special shout out to Katya, who I just met at the laundromat yesterday. And she actually started talking to me, and she's here. But anyway, and Karen. Hi, Karen. My name is Curtis Chin, and I'm the author of this memoir, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. And as the title says, I grew up in a Chinese restaurant. But I like to think of this as not just any Chinese restaurant. I like to think of this as the Chinese restaurant in Detroit. And the way I started to gauge it is I start off by asking people to guess how many egg rolls you think we sold in the 65 years that we own this business. Any accountants? Any math majors here? 650,000. Anybody? 65 years. Anybody else? Any other guesses? 200? Go ahead. Over a million.
How long?
65 years.
65 million.
Okay, she overshot a little bit. We sold over 10 million egg rolls, which is still a pretty good number, right? Because these were all handmade by my mom, my grandma, my aunties, so they were really, really good egg rolls, right? It was a great place to grow up, despite the fact that my hometown of Detroit was going through a lot of difficulties at that time. It was the 80s, the auto industry was struggling, there was crack cocaine, there was AIDS. I knew 5 people murdered by the time I was 18 years old. I mean, that's Detroit, right? It was a tough city. But despite all that, I feel like I had the best childhood because of this Chinese restaurant where my parents were able to teach me and my 5 siblings everything that we needed to get on with our lives. And that is the basis of this book. And so what we're going to do today is I'm going to read just the first page from the prologue, and talk a little bit about my family's journey to Michigan, right? And then we'll have a longer conversation, and I'll read a little bit more then. Sound good? Okay, great. So the book is divided into 3 sections of 8 stories each. 888, because, for Chinese people, that's good luck, right? And so I have 8 stories in elementary, middle school, 8 in high school, and then 8 in college. But I start out the prologue actually talking about my family's journey to Michigan. And there's 2 reasons why I start out the book this way. First is that a lot of times when you read about Asian American history or the journey of the Asians or Chinese to this country, it's always based off California or New York, right? You don't really think of Asians as being in the middle part of the country, and that's kind of where we were, like, as early as the 1800s. But the second reason is that I think that you can't really know someone's personal journey unless you know the families, right? Because so much about the way you see the world, the values, the things you strive for are really set in motion by them and the things that they want. And so that's why I really want to honor my family's journey. And so I'm just going to read the first page and talk a little bit about that. We good? Okay. Everything I learned in a Chinese restaurant. Welcome to Chung's. Is this for here to go? Armed with a smile and a red waiter's jacket with a perpetual plum sauce stain. That's how my dad greeted any new face who entered the lobby of our popular Chinese restaurant in Detroit. Interestingly, my great-great-grandpa, Gong Li Chin, had faced the same question in the late 1800s as he stood cold and alone on a rickety dock in Guangzhou, China, trying to decide his future and that of his young, impoverished family. For here to go. For here to go. As I got older, it was a question I asked myself. Starting in our restaurant's long and open back kitchen, where my family made some of our most popular items, including the tangiest barbecue pork and best-smelling almond cookies, my mom taught me my first lessons. Before diving into math, English, and geography, she began with a little American history, tales of elders and ancestors, our family as prologue. And so that's what the prologue does. It follows that journey. It starts off with Gong Li Chin, who came in the late 1800s. He moved from Canton, China to Canton, Ohio, before realizing there weren't actually Chinese people there. And so then he moved up to Detroit. This is actually before the auto industry was there, right? And so they were just starting. This is even before there was a Ford Motor Company. He tried to get a job in one of those factories, but a lot of the early Chinese immigrants faced discrimination. Like, they couldn't get those jobs. And so he took one of the few things available to him, which was the high-hand laundry. And he worked really, really hard, saved up his money, and was able to open up his own laundromat. And why that is so significant is because when the United States enacted this thing called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which you guys know about that, right? It's been in the news lately. basically the U.S. banned people from China coming to the United States. The first time they'd ever done that. But there were two exceptions to that rule, right? The first was that if you were a student, okay? And the second is if you owned your own business. And because he owned his own business, he was able to bring over his son and then his grandson. And that's why my family has this long history. And so that's what the prologue continues. It follows them, through opening up a grocery store in the 20s, the first restaurant in the 30s, and then eventually the one that I grew up in, which was opened in 1940. And the prologue takes us all the way up to the 60s. At that time, the United States was going through the civil rights struggle, which I guess we're still going through now, but there was a lot of violence, right? Like a lot of the big cities. And Detroit got hit really, really hard. Buildings were burnt down. People were being killed. There was so much violence that the United States sent in the National Guards, right, with tanks through the streets of Detroit. And they forced everybody to shut down. And if you know anything about Chinese restaurants, they don't close, right, for 5 days, which is what they were forced to do. But in those 5 days, my parents managed to find time to have sex. And 9 months later, I was born as their riot baby. And so people always ask me, like, why do you talk about social justice so much? And I always say, like, well, without that incident, I probably wouldn't be around. And so that's why I kind of have to do this. And so that's the journey of this book. It's about this great childhood, in Chinese restaurant. The book came out actually about two and a half years ago now, with Little Brown. And I've actually done close to 350 events, for this. This is my first one in Maine. So you guys are like the Maine premiere. But I've gone everywhere from Oxford University in the UK to, the largest U.S. military base in Asia. I've given talks at the Pistons, the Lions, It's just been this really incredible run. It's already in its fourth printing. The New York Times did a 2-page profile on me, and every other major media has covered it. And so I'm happy to be here with you all in Maine. So,
great.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you. Thank you for all of that background. I love that metaphor in that sort of opening section that you sort of bring up, which is like, for here to go. Like, I'd love to sort of get into your brain about that sort of writer's process of like, how did you land on that metaphor? Just because, obviously in your life, you have traveled many places, you have gone many places. This is a sort of persistent theme that we see throughout the book. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I actually don't have experience writing a memoir. I've never taken a memoir writing class, so I sort of just stumbled upon all these things by taking. I do have a writing background. My background writing is in poetry. And then after that, I somehow ended up in Hollywood writing TVs, and film. And so I'd taken screenwriting classes, but the idea of writing a memoir and that experience was just something I stumbled upon. The idea of the theme of the book, specifically for Here to Go, was actually just something that was, as you're writing, right, you're just writing down as many ideas and thoughts as possible, right? So the way I started this process was, maybe I should take one step back further. So, I was a TV writer, working for the Disney Channel when I get this terrible phone call that my parents were in a car accident back home in Detroit. And sadly, my dad died and my mom was severely injured. And my brother Chris, who was a doctor in California, immediately whisks my mom out to California to help her recuperate. And by the end of that first week, all my siblings decided they were also going to leave Detroit and go help my mom. And I was sort of left behind in Detroit trying to figure out, what to do. I mean, Hollywood is not a really receptive place for Asian Americans, as you know, because you were there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or do I stay in Detroit and take over this fabulous Chinese restaurant that I really, really enjoyed growing up in? And so I sort of split the difference. And I said, okay, I'm not going to go back and work for the studios anymore, but I will do more independent projects, things that will allow me to tell my voice as an Asian American. And when my siblings started having kids, that's when I decided to say, like, well, maybe I should write my own story, right? Because I want to share these stories with them, like in terms of growing up in this restaurant. And I just made a list of all the things that I learned growing up. I actually sent myself an email, everything I learned in Chung's. And so that was, one of those things that was in there, and it just sort of emerged as a theme. When I look back on my life, it was that struggle of, I love Detroit. I love being around there. I love my family. I love the food. It was the best food. I can't find that food anywhere else. But, Detroit was falling apart. I didn't think I could stay. So it was that struggle. And for people who haven't read the book yet, this is a spoiler alert. but that first scene of my great-great-grandfather standing on that dock in China is repeated. And the last scene is me standing on the train track in Detroit, leaving my ancestral homeland of Detroit and deciding that, like him, 100 years earlier, I needed to sort of go off and find my way too. So.
Absolutely. I think that's true of so many sort of, children of immigrants or second generation, third generation. They find themselves moving between spaces, traveling different places. I didn't expect to end up in Maine, but yet here I am. I'm from New York originally. You sort of bring up these dishes. I want to sort of talk about if there was sort of one core dish for you, like at Chung's, that was like, and you talk about this in the book a little bit. And so like, are there dishes for you that sort of really capture the spirit of that restaurant, that family, just because there is something unique or special about that you think encapsulate your family?
I mean, obviously, if you grew up in a Chinese restaurant, food is going to play a big part, right? It's like everything you think about, like from the moment you enter in, it's like preparing food for the people. And at the night, when you're closing, it's like, how do we wrap up this food and prepare for the next day? So your whole life revolves around food. But one of the running jokes in the book is that I grew up in a family of cooks. Everybody knew how to make something, right? Like my grandma made her, sweets. My grandfather made his barbecue meats. My dad, who was born in America, made the best Hong Kong food. My mom, who grew up in Hong Kong, made the best American food. Even my siblings could cook. Everybody could cook except for me. And so anytime they were getting ready to cook, I was the one banished to the dining room to go set the table. And so that was, a journey for me in the book in terms of learning how to appreciate food and how to become actually a good cook in it. But I don't know, so there's one dish that I actually eventually created that made it onto the menu called the tangy chicken.
Tangy chicken, that's what I was going to talk about. Can you describe that tangy chicken for us?
Well, this is pre-General Tso's, right? And like that. And so, so my trouble with making food, right? And so that was the beginning. It's like why I was a terrible cook. Something I realized after I went to college was that, when it came time to like standing at the wok and trying to make a dish to contribute to the family table, I had this problem where I just threw everything into the wok because I kept thinking like, oh, well, mom likes this and dad likes this and grandma likes this. You know what I mean? It wasn't until I got to college when I started to cook for myself, because when you're in college, you cook a lot for yourself, that I realized that instead of trying to please everybody, instead of making a dish that makes everybody happy, if you can make a dish that just makes one person happy, and that one person being myself, then maybe that's okay. No, I mean, sometimes we end up like always trying to people please, right? And it doesn't work out, right, in life. And so if you could just sort of focus on yourself, what you like, maybe people might come around. And so, I just thought about like, what were some of the ingredients that I like in the restaurant? And we had this sauce from one dish, and I combined it with the chicken from a different dish, and I, made a couple adjustments, and, and it was my favorite dish, and it ended up being on the menu.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that speaks a lot to your journey too, about sort of like what makes you happy isn't necessarily about pleasing your family. It's about, and it's sort of your journey of discovery. I think that's such a sort of present theme within it.
Yeah, and I don't know if people feel this too. I mean, like, being a middle child in an Asian family, family is so important, right? And you really try, especially when you see your parents sacrificing so much for you, right? You just feel like you want to do so much for them. And I feel like definitely, just had this concern of making sure that they were happy, but they didn't stress. Because I knew that my parents were under so much burden, operating a Chinese restaurant in Detroit, especially with all this violence happening and all this crime and stuff like that. I just never wanted to add to their troubles. I mean, that was my big thing growing up. It's like, I don't want to make their difficult lives any more difficult.
I think that sort of idea of hospitality also applies to Chung's because, as you write in the book, Chung's was such a sort of centerpiece. Like you had mayors coming in, you had famous people coming in. Like, what do you think sort of about that environment that led to sort of so many people sort of, was it just sort of how established it was? Like, was there a reputation that you had for your hospitality? Was it the food?
The
yeah.
food.
Yeah.
I mean, my grandma and my mom took 2 days to make those egg rolls, like because even the skin and all the sauce, everything was handmade. So that was why people came, but also because my dad and my grandfather, who were working in the dining room. A lot of times people ask me like, what's the greatest lesson that I learned working in this Chinese restaurant? And I think hospitality was the key thing from my dad, which is. Oftentimes when you're growing up, your parents say, don't talk to strangers. My dad, gave me the exact opposite advice. He said, talk to strangers. He's like, talk to the people in the dining room, make them feel welcomed, and there's also the added benefit of learning from these people too, because my dad was a kid who grew up in Chinatown. He never went to college. He didn't know what opportunities existed outside of those four walls of that Chinese restaurant. But he knew that he had this dining room full of people who did. And so anytime he met someone who seemed to be really happy at a cool job, he'd call all 6 of us kids to run in and just sort of barrage them with questions of like, what do you do for a living? How'd you get your job? How much money do you make? And it's just this idea of like not being afraid to talk to people who are different, not being afraid to learn and listen, to ask them questions when you don't know something, and most importantly, not to be afraid to ask for help, because, applying to college is not something that my parents knew how to do, but they had people who could say, these are the dates you need to look out for, these are the scholarships you need to look out for, and, I think that that's probably the greatest thing that I sort of learned. Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
Obviously being exposed to different cultures offers you a window into that world. You do highlight in the book a little bit about code switching, sort of like that discovery of code switching and, sort of encountering these different cultures, learning how to sort of navigate between those worlds. I think that's something that I think in the Asian American experience that I have found, like I spent a lot of time growing up watching PBS Jim Lehrer, memorizing his mannerisms so that I could integrate that into my speech. Like, when was the first time that you realized that it was like a conscious act?
Everybody knows what code switching is, the term? So code switching is basically do you want to explain what code
Go ahead, go for it.
I mean, it basically just means that, depending on what situation you're in, you might talk a little bit differently. You might behave a little bit differently. It's like reading the room and then being able to adjust, right? And I think that for some people, they push back against that. They think it's a burden to have to do that. It's like, why do I have to be a different person each time? It's like, for instance, like if I'm surrounded by a bunch of straight people, I might act differently when I'm around a bunch of gay people, or, class issues or whatever. But I actually think of it as like a positive skill set to have, because it allows you to access more people and to sort of, make friends with more people. And so I think it's, again, something I learned a lot in that Chinese restaurant, because even though we were at the restaurant for like 80 hours a week, like during the summers, like open to close, 7 days a week, I still felt like I saw the whole city because everybody came into our restaurant. Like you said, everybody from the mayor to the pimps and prostitutes on the street. So I really got to see the breadth of people, and, you learn that in some ways everybody's alike, and then you also learn how people are different too. And so I think these are really soft skills that are just really, really important, and that sort of guided me. And so like, this is why I feel comfortable whenever I'm dropped into any situation, like no matter what country. Like at this point, between the films that I make and the book, I've gone to over 1,000 places in like 20 countries giving talks. And so I think I wouldn't be able to do that unless I had that experience of growing up in this Chinese restaurant.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always sort of fascinated about like what that inner dialogue is. Like, at a certain point, it becomes like unconscious, like the switching does happen. Like, were there moments that were perhaps a little bit tenser when you realized like, oh, this is a choice for survival in this moment?
The biggest choice was when my family moved from a neighborhood that was primarily black to one that was primarily white, and, I really had to ask myself, how am I going to live surrounded by all these white people? And so my answer was, I'm going to become a Republican. And so I became really conservative, and I was like senior class president of the National Honor Society. I co-founded the Young Republican Club at school, Students Against Smoking. Margaret Thatcher was my imaginary girlfriend. I was like this total right-wing guy. And so that was my whole idea. And so that's part of the journey of the book. And then when I get off to college, I go off to Michigan, which I think sends me in the other direction. It's like, oh, these are liberals. Like, they're woke, so yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for sort of bringing up
Yeah.
that sort of backdrop of politics of where you were at the time.
Yeah.
Obviously, it was the 80s. And so I thought we might sort of talk a little bit more because, your uncle was the best man for Vincent Chin. And so obviously sort of being exposed to that, right? Everything changed for the community in 1982. And that was sort of a big sort of shifting moment. How did the Vincent Chin murder and the, specifically like the parallels that you see perhaps to the COVID era discrimination reshape your personal understanding?
How many people here know the Vincent Chin case? Do most people do? Okay, so some people don't know it. Okay, so this is 1982 in Detroit. The auto industry is really struggling, which led to a lot of anti-Japanese sentiments because it was the Japanese car companies that were overtaking America. Vincent Chin was a Chinese American who was out celebrating his upcoming wedding. He's goes to the strip club, and these two white auto workers come in. And at some point, they're overheard saying, "It's because of your mother blanks that we're out of work." And they're all kicked out. And these two guys get in their car, and they literally drive around the streets of Detroit until they see Vincent sitting outside of McDonald's waiting for his ride to pick him up. And they take a baseball bat out of their car, and they bash his head in. And because our families were close, my uncle was his best man, we found out that very next morning. And when you're a 14-year-old kid and you know somebody that's in the hospital literally struggling for their life, you're going to check the newspaper, right? You're going to check the papers. You're going to see how it's being reported on. And I didn't see anything. And so I checked the next day, nothing again. I checked the next day, nothing. I checked like 12 whole days, like in a row, nothing, until there was finally an article that appeared. Meanwhile, when you contrast that with the general media at that time, where they were writing all these stories about the white auto workers and how they were losing their homes and losing their jobs, it creates this atmosphere where you're not surprised when the judge several months later comes up with the sentence and says these two white auto workers would only have to pay a fine of $3,000. They never have to serve a single day in jail. And his rationale was, you don't put these kind of people in jail. And, as a Buddhist, I'm fine that he showed compassion for these guys, right? Because I'm sure that's not how they want to start their day, But I think the problem is that he had no compassion for Vincent's family, the fiance, you know what I mean? The mom who had just recently become a widow. And that really started me thinking like our stories are important. You have to tell our stories so that, when terrible things happen, you're not up against the 8 ball already. You know what I mean? I think that as people of color, sometimes that's the way the system's set up, where it's like we always have to prove our innocence over. We don't get some of these presumptions of innocence and all these other good things that we're told America's based off of, right? And so I think that's why I felt like, for me, telling our stories was important.
Absolutely. I've heard this from so many different parents of color who typically say, I'm not worried, child, that you're doing anything wrong.
Yeah.
I'm worried that if you do everything right, it still won't be good enough. And I think that's something that's really present within our communities.
Yeah.
And so, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's the other journey during this backdrop, which is obviously discovering your sexuality during the time of, Vincent Chin, the AIDS crisis in the 1980s, the police stings that you write about in your book. I do want to highlight sort of the more exciting parts when you were in college, when you were able to transition and sort of come out to your family at Drake's. And I sort of love that story right there about your new chosen family. How did that supportive environment at Drake's allow you to open up? What was it about specifically Drake's that finally allowed you to sort of come up so openly?
I don't know. So, I go off to college and, I'm one of those students that worked full time. And so, I was so worried that, because I had to pay for my own way in college, right? And so I worked full time. And I think because I was just there so much and it was like an artist, community and, and being away from my family for the first time, it just, you slowly take a step by step, right? And then there was another gay guy who was there, who was working, you know. And I think that just made it really easy. I don't know if there was like one specific moment where it's like, whoa, you know, I can come out to these people. I think it was just that general atmosphere. And plus, you know, Ann Arbor's full of liberals. So it's like, you know, that was the difficult part going in, because I went into college as a conservative, right? And I tried to like continue being a conservative in Ann Arbor. And yeah, that's just not the place. So, you know, I think because I didn't have, you know, a conservative community there, it allowed me to sort of open up and sort of see, well, what else is out there, right? Yeah.
I love that sort of exposure. I'd love for you to read, you know, a chapter.
Yeah, I would love to read this part about my mom. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So the book is really about my mom as much as it is about me and her journey. You know, so let me just set the stage for you. My mom was born in China. She was abandoned by her family, her parents, you know, as they were escaping the communists. And she eventually had an arranged marriage, and that's how she ended up in America. She really didn't like her life. She had a really difficult life and didn't like being in Detroit, and didn't like working in the restaurant. And she really wanted us, her kids, to get out, right? And her mantra to us growing up was, work hard, obey your elders, and be quiet. That's the thing that she just repeated all the time. It's very typical, right? Asian parents, like, work hard, obey your elders, and be quiet. And you know, she just saw that as our pathway in life. I did not see things the same way as she did, because as an 18-year-old kid in high school in the 80s, as a closeted gay kid, I did not think that I had a very long life to live. And there are two reasons for that. One is, as I mentioned, you know, it was the era of AIDS, right? And so anytime you saw a gay person in the paper, you know, they were in the hospital dying and they'd been kicked out by their family. It was just a really, really bleak time period to think about coming out. But the other reason was we had this one customer who would come in all the time by himself. He's one of my favorite customers. Come in, said he was an ER doctor, you know, come in at strange hours by himself. Turned out he was actually a famous psychiatrist who was coming to hire the prostitutes in our neighborhood, right? Because everything's cheaper in Chinatown. So he would come down to Chinatown. And he wanted to break off with this one girl, and the pimp got so upset that he also took a baseball bat and he bashed in his head and he killed him. But then he took a Ginsu knife and chopped up his body and littered it all the way up to the northern peninsula of Michigan. And so I think between those two things, I just really, I thought I'd be dead by the end of the decade. Because when you grow up with so much violence around you, it's not, you don't think like, oh, I'm going to have this long life, right? You feel like, how am I going to get, where does it end for me? And so I really just wanted to just travel around the world, or the United States, and sort of see the country, you know, if I felt like I was going to do anything. But again, my mom is this woman who just never had a chance to do anything in her life and really wanted to go to college. And so I made the determination that, like, what would be me giving up 4 years of my life for this woman who's given up her whole life for me? And so I made a deal with my mom. I said, okay, Mom, I will apply to college, but I will only apply to one school. And if I don't get in, I'm not going. And she said, okay, fine. You apply to Michigan. And so I applied to Michigan, and sadly, I got in. And so I ended up going to Michigan. Again, I was one of those kids that worked full time. I didn't know what I was going to study because I'm going for my mom, not for me. And so, you know, so I worked full time during the day and I took classes at night. And when you look at the course catalog at night, for some reason, there are a lot of creative writing classes, right? I don't know why, but there's just a lot of creative writing classes at night. And so I signed up for them, and I did the math, and I said, okay, if I studied poetry, right, and if I only wrote haikus, I could graduate in fewer than 500 words. And so that was like my whole idea, like, okay, that's how I'm going to graduate. And so I must have wrote a really good haiku because I got into the creative writing program at U of M, which only took about fewer than 20 people. Right, so it was a good program. So I'm going to read a story from that time period, okay? Oh, one thing about the chapters is that it's read like a Chinese menu, so this may not make sense to you, but this is chapter M7, okay? All right, I like to stand when I read. Okay. Chapter M7. Being a creative writing major made me the literary expert at Chung's. That was inevitable, as my dad asked every customer, Have you met our number 3? He's the writer in the family. Every time he mentioned my program, the number of students accepted got smaller and smaller. At some point, I expect him to say that I was the only one on campus even allowed to own a pen. One week, one of our waiters was out sick. My younger siblings were busy with their weekend activities, so I was the one called in to help. I jumped at the chance to have some home-cooked meals for a few days. I was running around the dining room, refreshing our customers' silver teapots, when a white middle-aged woman reached into her oversized bag and pulled out a colorful hardcover. Have you read this book? It's so good. The Joy Luck Club, the recently released novel that featured a bunch of old sassy Chinese ladies who like to eat, gossip, and play mahjong, could have easily been set in our back kitchen. Every time I came in to help at the restaurant, another diner, usually older and female, cited the most memorable characters, lines, and scenes. They all wanted to know if I was working on something similar. I was writing poetry, but they didn't care. To them, all writers were the same. They would squeal, "You could be the next Amy Tan." My mom turned out to be the biggest pusher. She rarely had a book in her hand, but the success of the Joy Luck Club convinced her that her life was a bestseller too. She followed me around the dining room, dropping stories from her childhood, the same ones I'd heard growing up, but now she recounted them as if she was auditioning for her own books on tape. One night, after seeing our waiters sometimes pool their tips together, my mom shared an oldie. When the communists marched south, they targeted my family. My uncles and grandpa were rich in America, so the Red Guard called us traitors. My stubborn grandma didn't want to leave her big home, so when my parents escaped to Hong Kong, they left me behind to keep her company. The communists hated me and my pawpaw. When I was 4, they made me watch as they forced my grandma to climb the old banyan tree in our courtyard. Then they pushed her off into a pile of broken glass. For a visual, my mom rubbed her knees. Another time, standing at the water station, she launched into her own nautical tale. When I was 5, my uncle in America paid $25,000 in renminbi, a king's ransom in people's money, to a local fisherman to ferry our remaining family out of China. After a long ride tucked under the planks of his fishy fishing boat, we came up for air. But we weren't in Hong Kong. The trader had turned us into the authorities. In jail, I had to sing Communist Party songs to earn extra rice for me and my grandma. Another chapter came as we stood beneath a painting of the Chinese countryside. When my pawpaw and I were freed from jail, we found that the officials had given away our home to peasants. We were forced to live several villages away in a dirt hut with 3 other families. Whenever we went out for a pail of water, my grandma had to bend low to keep her head below the soldiers. Once again, she gave me a demonstration, this time bowing her head. Granted, my mom's epic saga interested me. Who wouldn't be intrigued by tales of prison cells, guns, and stolen ransoms? Even the parts about her mundane life in Hong Kong after she was reunited with her parents and siblings were amusing. But these were her stories, not mine. She had to tell them, not me. I was in school to find my own voice. I sat and listened, but that was as far as it would go. Toward the end of the summer, as I was at the back table sipping my red pop, stockpiling poems for the upcoming semester, my mom sat down. Before I could say anything, she started talking. I was a top student in Hong Kong. When Pepsi came to town, they held a big contest for students to draw a picture of their own school. Mine was the best at Sacred Heart. I won 6 cases. There were so many bottles, I had to give some to the nuns. I threw down my Parker pen, the one I treated myself to after getting into the program. Yes, and they kept burping all day. It was so funny. You've told me that story over and over, and I don't even like Pepsi. I prefer Coke. My mom's shoulders shriveled. The shine faded from her rosy cheeks. You don't want to hear my story? I tensed up. I do, but I'm behind on my own stuff. Between working at Drake's, the Journal, and Saving the World, my schedule was packed. On top of that, my workshops in the fall were advanced. Still, insecure about my place in the program, I put pressure on myself to create more interesting writing by staying up late and scribbling in my notebook every detail of my life. But no matter how hard I tried, working harder could not produce a better poem. My mom lifted herself off her seat. The glint in her eyes orphaned me. Her 42 years of life flashed before my eyes. She'd gone from Guangzhou to Hong Kong to Detroit and spent the past 2 decades raising her 6 children in a hostile foreign land. She tried to prove that her life had worth, that it hadn't gone unnoticed, and here I was, that ungrateful son, writing it off. Her lips quivered in a soft murmur. I hastily picked up my pen, backtracking. Go ahead, Mom, I'll write it down this time. My mom bowed her head as if I were one of the soldiers holding a gun to her temple, ordering her to sing. No, you go on. You do your own thing. I reached out my hand, but by then she'd disappeared through the black swinging door, leaving only the rattling from the kitchen, the clanging walks and rumbling dishwasher. I sat there upset at myself for being so inconsiderate. Everything I'd done in the past 3 years had been for her, but it seemed as though I'd failed the final test. My education wasn't just to help me get a better life. It was for my whole family. We were a team. We were the 8 immortals. How could I let them down? I needed to make things right, but I knew that, like most disappointments in our house, apologies were never spoken. Only deeds would bring about reconciliation. So, this is for my mom.
So much of that resonates for me about speaking to my own mother, about how apologies worked in our own household.
Yeah.
I'd love to sort of wrap things up and sort of talk about that. Obviously you've been traveling a lot, and so what's next for you? Where are you headed? Where are you going?
The TV show.
Projects?
No.
Yes.
No. What's next for me? My day job is TV and film, and so I have a new film coming out with PBS on May 28th for American Masters. It's about a really wonderful sculptor based originally from Wisconsin. His stuff is really, really wonderful. But I am working on the next memoir. That's what I was doing all day this morning at Dutch's. I don't know if you guys go to Dutch's. It was a great place. They let me sit there for 5 hours writing, so that was nice. What else? Yeah, I'm trying. I was actually working. So I've been getting a lot of opportunities because of this book, to talk about Chinese food, right? So I wrote a piece for Bon Appétit that got selected for Best American Food Writing. I got asked to produce a podcast episode for America's Test Kitchen. Just a lot of great things. And so I was going down this vein. I was actually working on a 6-part docuseries on the history of Chinese restaurants in America. I don't know if any other Chinese restaurant kids here. But you can really, interestingly, chart the geopolitics and immigration, by the Chinese food that was available, right? So when you look at that first wave, like from my family, it was all Southern Chinese, Cantonese food, right? Dim sum and things like that. Mm-hmm. And then in the 40s, when we normalized relationships with China, you suddenly had, Hunan and Szechuan food coming in. 60s, you had Mandarin food coming in. Richard Nixon goes to China and you suddenly see Peking duck as something that people are eating. And then now, with globalization and, the changing power dynamics, you suddenly see high-end Chinese, Asian, restaurants, global chains coming in. And when you think about soft power and how America has been able to export so much of our influence through the food, right? Whether it's McDonald's or KFC, and now suddenly you have things like Jollibee and, Gongcha Cafe coming to America. What does that say about, what are the implications, right, of geopolitics. And so I was working on a documentary on that. I had interest from several major corporations like Ford Motor Company, because we were just going to rent a Ford vehicle and just drive around the country and go to all these Chinese restaurants. But sadly, we're at this moment in this country right now where there's a lot of anti-DEI, fervor, thanks to someone in the White House who, doesn't appreciate the diversity of our country. And so a lot of those funding opportunities that we had dried up within the last year and a half. And so I'm going to put that project on hold. My producer feels that he can still try to raise money instead to do a 6-part docuseries on Chinese restaurants around the world and how they sort of developed in different countries. And so, if we can raise the funds for that, that would be really great. But until then, I'm working on the next memoir, which picks up right where this book, happens. And so, I'm cautiously optimistic. My publisher hasn't bought the book yet, but they're the ones who asked for it. They asked me to write a book in my 20s when I moved to New York. So, knock on wood. I think that because they asked for it, they'll make some offer on it. If they don't like it, they'll lowball me. You know what I mean?
Well, knock on wood, we hope that you bring back your second memoir, because I'd love to talk to you again. And you should come back to Maine.
Yeah, definitely.
I know that you're headed up north immediately, right?
Yeah, I'm going up to Colby. So I'm here until Monday, So I guess I'll have a free day tomorrow. Maybe I'll go eat a lobster roll or something like that. I don't know what I'll do, but I'll just try to get writing done. So I'm treating this weekend as sort of like a nice little retreat for me, a little writer's retreat.
Absolutely.
And then I go up to Colby, and then I go to Michigan. So my book is currently what's called the Great Michigan Read. So once every 2 years, they choose one book, and they buy 7,000 copies, and they give away free. So they've got this, and they print a special edition. They put this little sticker on it, and then they give it away to all these schools and libraries in the state. And then they put me on this tour, a 30-city tour of the state. And if you know Michigan, there aren't 30 cities. So I'm going to a lot of really small places and really strange, things I've never heard of in Michigan, which is kind of nice, because I'm getting to see all day, and I'm getting to tell the story. And why it's so important to me is because as someone who grew up in the public schools my whole life and never seeing my family story and never, in some ways, always wondering if my family's long history was included in this idea of what does it mean to be someone from Michigan, to have people come up to me, who stereotypically would be like, rural white conservative people coming up to me and saying, thank you for telling our story, is just really nice because it makes you feel included and it makes you feel welcomed. And that's why we write and that's why we tell our stories, because we want to make these connections with people, right? You want people to see themselves in your story, even if on paper it doesn't really make sense. And that was one of my goals of writing the book, and the fact that it's been so embraced by my home state has been really great. So, but hopefully the people here in Maine will also find yourself in this book too. Yeah.
I absolutely did.
Great.
I'd love to open it up to Q&A now. And so, if anybody has any questions.
Before you open up Q&A, we always do a selfie.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's do a selfie.
So let's do a selfie. It's very staged. So you hold the book. Marfine, you can hold it too.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Okay. So squeeze in on the side if you can for the people. Okay, if you guys can. Squeezing in? Okay. And I'm going to do a little, okay. Okay, say hi, everybody. Hi.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now we can do Q&A.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have too many.
Oh,
Okay.
cool.
Curtis, can I just tell you the topics and then maybe you pick which one? I wanted to know more about Motown. I want to know what kind of conversations you had or remember hearing about what they were talking about, what was going on in China. Because there's a lot going on in China while things weren't being talked about in America, what your family was saying or doing, or if they weren't. I wanted to know more about just the Motown thing and music and any of that. And I just also wanted to tell you, I read the book last Saturday. It took me 7 hours. It was a great day.
Oh, okay.
And I was very proud of myself.
Oh, nice.
And thank you for coming.
Yeah.
And then the last thing is the scene in the restaurant with the drag queen. Very powerful scene. And so I just wondered, with Detroit and everything like that, if after that experience, if you'll write about it more, how you learned about the community, the gay community, and what was going on any further while you were in Detroit.
Yeah.
So those are 3 things I'm wondering.
Well, thank you for reading the book and reading it in 7 hours. That's really great. No, it really is a compliment when someone says they read your book in one sitting. I mean, that's nice. So the whole Motown thing, I weave a lot of Motown in it, right? Because that was one of my strategies in terms of how do you connect with an audience. Because I think that sometimes when, I don't know if this is the writers or the editors who's deciding these things, but a lot of times when you read stories by people of color, they're oftentimes presented as sort of like this sidecar to what American history is. And so for me, it was very intentional to make sure that I weaved in Detroit history in it, so that even if you weren't Asian American or whatever, and you picked up the book, you could see yourself in the book. So I talk a lot about the Detroit Hudson's, the department store closing, or the Tigers winning the World Series, all these things which allow people access to the story. And obviously Motown music's one of the biggest things, right? I have this whole big story about because Diana Ross was like my girl, like growing up. And so she comes up as my angel in some ways. But I don't, and here's the other thing about writing a memoir is that sometimes you forget what's in the book and what's not in the book, right? Because you write all this stuff and you forget did the editor drop that or not? So, yeah. So,
Did you meet any musicians
From Motown?
in your restaurant?
Joni Mitchell was like the most famous person who would come in, but the one key story that I remember, and this is the weird thing that I remember about, like, because I love Diana Ross, but my mom hated Diana Ross, and the reason she hated Diana Ross was because she said it was unfair that Diana Ross, who was lighter skinned and looked more white than the darker skinned lead singer who had been pushed aside. And she said, that's not fair because she's not the talented singer. And so my mom was always about meritocracy. And I don't know why that really stuck out, that my mom was really super woke, like to know about colorism back then, right? Yeah, isn't that weird? Yeah. But I can't remember if that, I guess it didn't end up in the book. Yeah, okay. But, so Motown was just a big thing. But I will have to say, with my next book, which takes place in 1990 after I moved to New York, my new queen becomes Madonna. So I have a new Detroit icon singer to sort of guide me, and that's sort of what I do in life. But yeah, I'll ask other questions, and I'll go back to you if you want, in case there's anybody else. Yeah.
We're going to fight.
So welcome to Maine, and thank you so much for coming to Maine. So my parents escaped from communist China. They were landlord class and escaped to Taiwan and then came here to Maine.
Wow.
And so I was wondering what your family's reactions were to hear their stories, because I am writing a story for my parents as well, just for the grandchildren, great-grandchildren. But I remember that as a teenager, the war stories were so horrific. As teenagers, we could not. We asked them to stop, and amazingly, they did. And now I wish I had asked more, because when my dad was on hospital, I did ask some more questions, and my mom too. But I was just wondering what your family's reactions were, and what your mom thought of her story as well.
Well, so my family hasn't read the book. They're not going to read the book. Well, I mean, that's their choice. I'm not going to force them to read it. But, according to my sister, she has zero interest in learning about my sexual awakening. So that's okay. My brothers are like, well, that's your version of the history. But I do think that they support me, because whenever I post up on Facebook, they do hit the like button. So I think that means something, right? And I know that for my mom. I know that my mom, who's had this really tough life and has always felt, unseen, I think that it's brought her a lot of joy. Whether it's like attending my readings when I do them in the Bay Area, or the fact that her friends from Detroit call her up whenever I'm on TV or whatever, and, gives her some pride, you know what I mean? Because that's what she lived for, I guess, in some ways. I don't agree with that philosophy in life. Like, I think she should have lived for herself. But if that's what she's going to do, then I'm happy that I can give that, to her. This hasn't been announced yet publicly, but I'm getting a big award in July from an Asian American civil rights group, and I'm going to fly her out to watch that. So yeah. So if I can do little things like that for her, Thank you.
I have a question. How did you find out that you wanted to become a writer?
How did I find out I wanted to become a writer? I don't know. It just sort of happened. Like I said, I'm not really, you know what I mean? Like I went into college not knowing what I was going to do. So, I don't know. I don't know how I have this life. I really don't. I've never taken a filmmaking class. I've never taken a memoir writing class, but yet somehow I make a living doing this kind of stuff. But I do think that I was primed for it because, like I said, even though we didn't have books growing up, surrounding, I wasn't one of those people. I didn't read as a kid. Like I said, like the only book that we had at the restaurant was the phone book. And what I would do is I'd just look up, every now and then I'd look up the number of Chinese people in there. Like every time a new edition would come, I was like, how many Chinese people? That was the extent of my reading as a kid. But I do think that I was being groomed to be a writer because, again, we had this dining room full of people who shared their stories with me. And so I listened a lot, right? And I feel like I love stories because of that. love meeting people. I'm a people person. I'm an extrovert, and because the other thing too, as a middle child, like you're not always the focus of things, and so you observe a lot, right? And so I think because of all that, maybe that's why I have the skill sets to do this work. But it wasn't something that I really always thought about. And I honestly think I don't know what I would do. Like I have no other skills. You know what I mean? I could manage a restaurant. That's probably the only other skill I have in life, right? Yeah, but yeah, I don't know.
Okay, how did your mom? You said you went to college for your mom, but what made you want to do that? I know you feel like you owe her, but yeah, why? How did you have that feeling?
I think I mean, how did I know that it was so important to her? Because she said it. Like, I want you to go to college. You have to go to college. You know what I mean? Like, I'm working really, really hard. You need to go to college. And I'm like, yeah.
So she's like your teacher too.
Oh, she's totally my teacher. She's totally like, it starts off, she was my first teacher. She literally, when we were younger, would give us extra homework, right? Like she would like sit there and individual. And because she had 6 kids, she'd have to each one of us got our own set of extra math problems and stuff like that. Yeah, no, she's a tiger mom. You know what I mean? Like in that sense, yeah, I mean, she helped us the best she could, right? Because she never graduated high school herself, but she really understood the importance of education. And I do thank her, and I am appreciative of it, but not in the way that you might think. I mean, so on one hand, yes, I found a career because I did the creative writing program, so I have a career thanks to college. But I think more importantly, and not to get too dark, but I think I have a life because I went to college. Because at that time, if I had moved to New York or San Francisco, I probably could have, contracted AIDS, more likely than, say, being in a small Midwestern town like Ann Arbor and being really celibate, right? Because my brother was on campus, so I wasn't doing anything, you know what I mean? So, I think that, which delayed my, sexual activities through a critical time period of the disease, I don't know. Maybe that saved me. You know what I mean? So yeah. I guess I could say that I owe my life to my mom in more ways than one, right? She kept me safe. She told me, this is where you need to be. You need to be in college. You need to be, because she wanted me to go to Ann Arbor. You have to go to Ann Arbor. You know what I mean? So yeah. Yeah, she's really great. Yeah.
Among all the places that you have given talks about your book, can you name a couple places that was most memorable to you from the people that you interact with?
Portland, Maine. God, it's so great. I mean, there's such a range. I mean, for one thing, I get all these young kids, who come up to me who are working in their family businesses. And it's not even just Asian, right? Latino kids, Jewish kids. And they'll be like, oh, I'm working in my family's Mexican restaurant or Jewish deli or whatever. And sometimes they just break down and cry. It's not like I like crying kids, but, they just I feel like I can give them hope. I can say something positive, say whatever struggles you're going through right now is just temporary. And part of it is the tension that they have with their parents. And I said, you may think your parents are awful right now, but give it some time. You know what I mean? And your relationship with your parents will change. It's not always going to be this way. And have a little grace to give them some room too, because they're just people too. And I feel I don't know if they want to hear that. Maybe that's not, but I feel I want to say that to them. But I think the other bigger thing is, so the city of Detroit has gone from a population that was close to 2 million down to 500,000. So it's lost so many people, and those people are scattered all over. And so a lot of places I go, I will meet former customers, who will share these wonderful stories. And the one story that I really, really love to share a lot is I was doing this reading in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and this woman, gets up at the end. It's a packed reading at a bookstore, and it was early in the run. And she's like 60-ish odd years old, and she's like, has anybody here ever eaten at Chung's? And nobody had, because we're in Massachusetts. But she said, I grew up in Detroit. Your family's restaurant was my favorite growing up. My family would go there every Sunday, and we always ordered the same 5 dishes. And she said that's her happiest memory growing up. And then she said, she told her mom that she was coming to this reading by one of the kids from Chung's, and her mom, who has dementia now, right, recounted all of our dishes in vivid details. And she said for the first time in years, she felt that she had her mom back. And it's really moving to me because I feel like growing up, I always knew that my parents were really working hard to give us a good life. I didn't realize that they were also fighting hard to give Detroiters a good life, because the city was really collapsing at that time. Like every good business was closing, all the restaurants, all the places to get food. There were fewer and fewer places for people just to have a normal life, just to have a nice meal. And my parents struggled really, really hard to continue to provide that. And they welcomed everybody into their space. And I feel like that idea, the idea of these small restaurants and these small family businesses as being these critical spaces for community building, it's just something that's really stuck out at me, particularly because we have this really divided country right now where we don't even talk to one another. But Chinese restaurants are one of those few places where you can go and see somebody from a different race, culture, class background. If you could just lean over and just strike up a conversation with the person next to you, maybe that's what our country needs to sort of start healing some of these divisions. So the way I sort of pitched my book to my agent was like, come for the talk on racism, but stay for the, come for the talk on racism, stay for the egg rolls. You know what I mean? It's just using food as a way to sort of heal our country and bring us back together, I think, and what my parents are doing is part of that, and how food and restaurants help build community. And I feel like that's something I really think about a lot more.
I think that's a wonderful way to button today's conversation. We do have books for sale. Curtis will be signing books if you'd like to. There's a Venmo back there if you'd like to purchase it. It's $22 for a book. Curtis will sign it. We're going to hang out for a little bit of space, but we're going to wrap up around 5:30 or so. But please feel free to hang out, talk a little bit more. Thank you so much for everybody coming, and thank you, Curtis.
Thank you. You can follow me on Instagram if you want.
Yeah.
See if the picture looks okay.
What's your Instagram?
Curtis Chen 8.
Curtis Chen 8.
Yes.
Great. Excellent.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks so much.